What's up, Patreon, and welcome to your second weekly VOD that you have financed through your generosity here at the Nerd Castle. If you're new and you didn't know that you got this by any chance, you were just like supporting the channel or whatever, this is definitely a cool thing for me because this allows me to get into contact with all of you, and it also gives me an opportunity to do VODs on like weird subjects. And so anyways, last week we talked about the Nintendo Switch, which had just come out, or at least all of that information from like Kotaku and IGN and all those different sources and Reddit and all the various places. It all come together, and we got to talk about the Nintendo Switch for a little bit, and I thought that was a lot of fun. This week, we're going to be talking about Shadowrun and why it's one of my favorite universes to RP in. I've been really addicted to Shadowrun for a long time. It's one of those things that I've been very stoked about since I was first introduced to it. It's a setting that I think is great for role-playing. Like, some settings are just really good for role-playing, VTM, Shadowrun. I think some things are overdone, like fantasy, very overdone. Like, it's hard for you to carve out a niche for yourself in something like D&D and make like a unique, weird, odd character that doesn't come across as overly Mary Sue-ish or anything like that. And Shadowrun is a setting that's very much attracted me for a long time. And so what I'm going to do in the future is I'm actually going to change these videos around. You're no longer going to see my face talking to you, or you might for the introduction or whatever. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and get some video gameplay footage going on in the background for you guys to check out, so that you can watch me play video games or whatever. I'll do like a light interview on camera first, and maybe this will suck up into the corner like it does during streams or whatever else, and you guys can watch the cool stuff going on screen. If I can make it thematic, like if we talk about 40K, hopefully it'll be like a 40K game. If we're talking about pixel games, it'll be some kind of pixel game, you know what I mean? That would be a really cool thing, I think, to do, and we're going to start doing that maybe next week or the week after. But for right now, you just got to look at my ugly mug and my big wooden balls that I'm wearing on the outside today. I have no idea how these got around my neck. I started the VOD, and there they were, and I was like, well, they're on now, whatever. It's going on camera, and people can judge how they want to judge. A man with balls on his chest and around his neck and everywhere else. But yeah, Shadowrun. I was introduced to Shadowrun the first time when I was about 11 or 12 years old. A friend of mine had gotten Shadowrun for the Super Nintendo and was playing the hell out of it and was just convinced that it was like the coolest game ever. And so I went over to his house and I played some Shadowrun with him, and I was like, damn, this game rules. Like, it was rare at the time to get something. Everything during that time period was 100% just Final Fantasy JRPG type stuff, and so it was cool to get a game that was set like in the modern world with guns but with orcs and like sorcery, because at the time I was very much a Lord of the Rings fan. Like, I think when you're like 12 years old, you get introduced to like Lord of the Rings. Like, maybe you'll get it as part of like a school assignment or something like that. You get The Hobbit or whatever, and you get super into Tolkien. And like, that's what happened to me as I got into that, and then all of a sudden I was introduced to this universe where you have orcs and elves and, you know, gnomes and all kinds of stuff transposed into a futuristic environment where it's like, oh, what if you had an orc who had like an Uzi, you know what I mean? And for me, that was just fascinating. The fact that you could cast fireballs with one hand, but on the other side be spraying with an Uzi out of your other hand, like, that was just something that hooked me instantly, because it was something unique for the time that you didn't see very often. And so anyways, a little while later, I went to GameStop. It wasn't GameStop at the time, it was Funkoland or EB Games or something like that. And I went in there and I saw a copy of Shadowrun for the Sega Genesis sitting on the shelf. And I thought it was the same game for the Super Nintendo, because back at the time what they would do is they would make the same game and then they would nerf the graphics a little bit for one. The Sega Genesis had a better sound chip if you had like the Gen 1 Sega Genesis, which I did. But in general, the SNES looked better, but the Sega Genesis sounded better, because people just like the sound chip better on the old school Sega Genesis. And so I got it, and I took it home, and I was actually floored to find out it was not the same game. But I started playing through it, and you're playing as Joshua, who's like this badass dude who's come to Seattle to find out who killed his brother Michael. And you're running through like this sprawling storyline, and it was one of the first real sandbox games I had ever played in my entire life, which at the time, for that generation, you didn't get a lot of sandbox games. There were a lot of heavily linear, narrative-built RPGs, but sandbox games didn't exist, and it was kind of cool getting your feet wet with a game on the Sega Genesis that allowed you to do whatever you want. You can earn money however you want, you can level up your character however you want, you can add skill points to a character sheet however you want, and that was something that was very novel for the time. Was a little bit grindy? Absolutely, but everything at the time was grindy, and so you can't really make a complaint along that line. That was just a standard of the time when it came to RPGs, and I was just enthralled. I was fascinated. I loved all the characters, you know, from, I think there was Rihanna Heartbane to, I think you had Winston Mars. I loved all the characters in that game. I fell in love with them instantly and just really enjoyed playing it. To this day, I think I've played probably thousands of hours on that game. I still have my copy. I still break it out every now and again and just play it ad nauseum until I can't stare at it anymore. I think it's a really fantastic game, and that kicked off my love for Shadowrun. And so I wanted to talk about some of the reasons why I like Shadowrun. The first and foremost, the biggest argument I can see for Shadowrun is the detractors for Shadowrun. I would say you're not going to be into Shadowrun if you don't like excessive crunch in your games. For people that don't know, in tabletop, there's crunch and there's fluff. Crunch is essentially the rules, the dice, the math, everything that goes into playing the game. And Shadowrun is a very, very crunch-heavy game. Like, it takes an absurd amount of rolls just to do any simple action, and I think that's going to turn people off a lot from the game. But I think it makes up for that factor by having fluff, which is the lore and kind of the filling of the world and the way characters interact with one another in the RP setting. I think the filling and the fluff are really, really good for Shadowrun because you've got a diverse world in which everything that exists in the real world exists, and that's what I like most about it. I like the fact that it really sucks you in and becomes immersive because your characters in Shadowrun spend their days, aside from shooting machine guns and doing really, really cool stuff on the side, all the stuff in between your missions and your Shadowruns are your guys just doing stuff that you or I would do in our real life, surfing the internet, dicking around and watching Trid, you know, which is essentially the video of the time, messing around playing video games. You can do all of that stuff in Shadowrun. It all exists. It's all been up-converted 150 years into the future. But at the same time, the nice thing about Shadowrun is that that setting is still grounded. Like, it's not high futurology. Instead, it's the culmination of what you would expect. Like, the internet has evolved in a way that you would expect it to evolve. Video games have evolved in the way you would expect them to be evolved. They aren't like these explosive, crazy, like 3D things that you do, although they can be if you really, really want to, with like, you know, which you can do with stuff like SimSense chips and stuff like that, but at the same time, stuff has just evolved along the path that you would think, and so what I think is nice about that and it's immersive is that you can see yourself in that situation, therefore it's easy to roleplay a character in that situation. You can have a Shadowrun character who is addicted to playing video games. He just loves playing whatever the iteration of Xbox is in between getting down and dirty in the streets. You can have a character who is a gang member. Just like you would be a gang member in real life, you would be a Blood or a Crip. That all exists inside the world of Shadowrun just as a default, and it's a major part of the world. It's part of the lore. These groups exist. They fight over territories. They have areas of Seattle that are theirs that they fought for hundreds of years with other groups. Some gangs are ethnic. Some gangs are magical. Some gangs are just purely out to make money and hold down a turf. Some gangs are proxies for like mafia groups and the Yakuza and stuff like that. And that's what I like about it, is that everything makes sense within the context of the world, and it's all stuff that exists in the real world. If you want your character in Shadowrun to join the Triads exist. And they have evolved over the last 100 years just like video games have, or just like TV has. They are still the same recognizable triads from the 1980s or the 1990s in the United States or from anywhere else, but at the same time, they've evolved a little bit. They've incorporated technology. They've incorporated magic, and they've incorporated, you know, Taoism or Shintoism or, you know, Shaolin monk faith into the way that they function if you're with the Yakuza or the Triads, or if you're with the Russians, or if you're with the Italian mob. They've all taken all these things, and like for the Italians, for example, they're Roman Catholic, but they've incorporated kind of the mysticism because magic now exists in the world. They've incorporated that into their beliefs. And the fact that you've got embellishments on stuff that exists in the real world, I think is one of the major selling points for Shadowrun, and I think it's one of the things I very much like. It's a thing that you can identify with. At the same time, the thing that makes it fresh and makes it clean is that you've also got this burst of magic in. And so if you're into D&D and stuff like that, but you're not so much into the real world, there are still these footpaths that you can take to kind of get yourself into the setting. Elves exist, dwarves exist, orcs exist, magic exists, mysticism exists, divination exists. All of those things dwell alongside, and it gives you a very, very cool, what I like about that is that it gives you a kind of a yin and a yang. You're living in high future technology, but at the same time, you've got shamans, and you've got people that go out into the woods to create runic circles, and they go out into the woods to create lodges where they research this very primal and natural and ancient thing. And that exists side by side, and in fact, with the incorporation of technomancers, magic has now begun to eke into technology, so you've now got mages that can control technology, because technology has gotten so advanced that it's become a part of people. And when the technology becomes a part of people, it becomes intertwined with the magic and the essence that exists in those people too. And I've always found that to be a very, very stark contrast between the two things and the way that they are distinct from one another, but at the same time, they're separate in their roots and where they come from. And so anyways, Shadowrun is a fantastic setting. You guys know that with Roll For It, I've been very, very into Shadowrun. It's one of the few things in life that I'm incredibly enthusiastic about. I absolutely love it, and I think it's a setting that lends itself to be whatever you want it to be. Whereas stuff like D&D and Dark Heresy, they tend to be a little bit lighter on the roleplay, but a little bit heavier on combat and stuff like that. Shadowrun is a world where combat is deadly as hell. Like, you could die instantaneously in Shadowrun from one sniper bullet. And so really you want to minimize the chances of going into combat as much as possible. It's a game of intrigue where you've got corporate powers fighting against one another. You've got gangs versus corporations, gangs as proxies of corporations, mages working on behalf of research labs. You've got naturalists that have, you've got guys that are out there doing science on magical creatures that now exist, who are linked with certain colleges, who then have corporate overlords who are funding research. And so you've got like this wonderful world for like intrigue and random stuff going on that really, really gets you into it. And at the same time, you can imagine all of those things happening in our modern world should magic all of a sudden erupt here. Everything functions exactly the way, in a cynical and yet functional and capitalist way that you would expect it to. And so anyways, I wanted to talk briefly about Shadowrun and the things that I liked about it and how it's a big part of my life. If you never had a chance to play Shadowrun, don't be off-put by like the rule sets and like some of the nastier, crunchier stuff that exists inside of it. The stuff that you're gonna have to bang your head against in order to play the game. I know it's a thick game and it's a difficult game to get to the bottom of. It's kind of like playing VTM and stuff like that, where there are games out there that it takes a little bit to get into the swing of things. But Shadowrun's been a huge part of my life. I hope that you can see my enthusiasm for it there. And so in summation, the things that I like about Shadowrun, the big one that I know you've heard me express is that it's accessible to people that are into modern settings without going too far into the future. It's accessible to people who are into fantasy because it's essentially a D&D setting that's just been moved forward by 2,000 years worth of technology. It's 1996 with futurology and all of the Tolkien races. Number 3, the thing is that it's so accessible for people because we live in the modern world and it's a game that you play in the modern world. It's very, very easy for new players to roleplay inside of because it's like, oh, well, what does your orc decker think about video games? I don't know. What do I think about video games in real life? Do I enjoy them? Then yeah, my character's probably into video games in that setting. I love the fact that they convert all of the real world stuff like the Mafia and just going down to like the corner store, going to 7-Eleven, picking up a soda. That's a thing that you can totally do inside of Shadowrun. If you're like, yeah, I'm going to put my holdout pistol in the back of my pants because I'm gang affiliated and, my enemies might try and come and find me. And if you want to walk down the street to go get yourself a soy calf and then walk back home, that in and of itself can turn into a giant adventure with just things happening. And so I very much like the stark contrast of technology versus magic and kind of hellhounds and dragons and things existing alongside virtual 3D sets and an interactive internet called the Matrix where you can actually immerse all of your senses into an online world. It's just a fantastic setting, and so you should give it a try. Check it out. I very much like Shadowrun. This is a Patreon VOD, a bonus Patreon VOD for the people that jumped into Patreon. They get it a little bit early, and then people on YouTube will get it a little bit later. If you wanted to support the channel and you're seeing this on YouTube, I got the link for you down below for my Patreon. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope that I've piqued your interest for playing Shadowrun. If nothing else, play the Super Nintendo game, and if that puts you in a situation where you felt like you wanted more, like a more sandboxy version of the SNES game, check out the Sega Genesis one too. I'm sure you can emulate them all. Or I'm definitely not advocating for you emulating. Don't go do that. Go buy a legitimate copy so that you can then emulate legally. I don't know. I'll see y'all later. Thanks for stopping on in. It's been a blast, everybody. I love Shadowrun.